So there are some signs that because you don't necessarily have to run out and get a leptin panel.
Mm,
That's certainly helpful to understand, like if you're very high or very low, because you can be leptin resistant and have high leptin, and that's typically more of your when you're overweight, but you can be severely underweight as well and be leptin resistant kind
mm.
of on the other side. More typical is the overweight side. But some of those quick markers is if you're overweight by more than 25 pounds, that is a general sign that you've got some leptin resistance going on. And then there and then like you were saying, it ties a lot into our circadian rhythm. And
Right.
that's one of the great things about FTN with the dress protocol is it's essentially trying to get back in your circadian rhythm and eating healthy. So it addresses a lot of those things, but there are some nuances and specifics that kind of where you can optimize more for that. Some other symptoms would be like if you have some intense carb cravings, especially at night. If you're constantly feeling like you need to snack, those are signs that it's malfunctioning and isn't working properly. Another one would be sleep disruption and just general or if just general circadian disruption. I've got a cool little quiz on my website that it's not necessarily a definitive lab, but you can answer like in under a minute. You can answer some questions and get a good idea on what kind of a level of leptin, like if you might be considering that, or if some of this sounds like you, like it can give you a good idea. Oh yeah, I probably should explore this a little more.
Where can people find that? It's a little early, but Tracy, if you are there, like, if what's your website? Because people are going to want to check
Yeah,
that out now.
it's it's saintwellness.org, and then in my menu there's a thing for the leptin resistance quiz.
Awesome, and thank you, Tracy. Okay, but one of the things, yeah, with the lab testing, I'm biased towards that, right? Just 'cause I'll run it on pretty much anything. To your point, though, this is one that I do believe that you could see a lot of the stuff that's going on, or even
Mhm.
just answer that quiz and get a good hint there. I do think labs are almost a personal thing for certain people in the sense that, like, all right, would I tell pretty much anyone, hey, maybe don't eat gluten again? I think I will, especially American wheat and stuff like that. But did I need to see that in the lab tests for me to actually permanently remove it? I did. I'm like a little kid. I needed to see red bad. Okay, Evan, you don't do that anymore. And then
Mhm.
somehow I can maintain that for 7, 8 years, but I needed to see it. So similarly, it can be cool to track it over time if someone has the funds and means to do that and see where they'd be at. But if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sorry, I wouldn't expect you to know this offhand, but leptin is one of the more expensive ones to run by itself, right? Isn't that anywhere from I my gut wants to say $80. Does that sound right?
It sounds right, and I'm trying to think. I actually looked it up on Avexia the other day because you can get it added to if you're doing a normal blood draw. Sometimes you can get added for not quite as much,
Okay.
but yeah, that's where. And then just like a general marker, if you do ever get it run, you want to be between like 4 and 9,
Mhm.
and that's nanograms per milliliter. Women can run a little bit higher just naturally because they have a little bit more fat,
Mhm.
but that's in the range. You don't want to be much over 9 because that's where you're getting more of that circulating and your body's not responding to it.
Sure. So yeah, you don't guys don't have to go out and get this marker, but it could be a cool thing like an add-on to another panel. And then again, there's always going to be the FDNs and or listeners out there that just they can't resist. They got to run
Mhm.
it all. So, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say another lab that sometimes this can come up on where it's like indirectly measuring it would be like if you're running a thyroid panel, because a lot of times if you have thyroid issues, you've got leptin issues because the leptin is upstream from the thyroid and then interacts with all those things. It's not a typical one like on your basic thyroid panel, but if you're having some thyroid issues and you're wanting to look at this as well, it would be you want to look up your T3, and then if that's elevated, especially outside of optimal, that's a sign that the T3 to T4 conversion is off and it's going more to your reverse T3, and that is a definite connection with leptin resistance.
Very cool. And this is what's so interesting with you mentioned how FDN, oh, we touched on the circadian rhythm side, obviously, so that could help
Mhm.
the leptin thing. Similarly, Cruz talks about the leptin protocol, but the reality is the action steps on both sides, and probably even a third and fourth side here that we're not talking about right now, end up being foundationally similar enough. And the funny thing is, I look at most insert XYZ protocol for a hormone here, like testosterone protocol, estrogen protocol, whatever it might be that you want. so much of that stuff, if you do the right things with your body, your hormones, I found at least, seem to naturally go
Mm.
the way that they should be going. So if you have a locked in circadian rhythm, you're not eating right before bed, and you are doing most of your other lifestyle stuff, a lot of those hormones, guys, are going to stay pretty healthy for a while. It's just how many people are actually outside all day doing the right stuff that they need to be doing, probably few and far between. I wanted to go back to the first part of your answer with leptin, and I don't know if we even needed to touch on this. Maybe you've already covered it, but you had said that outside of the, I want to get the wording right. I think you said something along the lines of outside of the stuff like the cravings for carbs all the time or snacking all the time or waking up, there could be other things and other concerns with why you'd want to make sure you're not leptin resistant. So, do we get to touch on that stuff yet? Or what are some of the more disconnected things that are not necessarily obvious that might be a complication of this leptin resistance?
So, some of the ones that aren't quite as obvious would be one is reproductive health, because you need adequate levels of leptin in your system to be able to for fertility and egg production. And then also another one is immune health, because leptin helps modulate your immune response. So, too much leptin actually can be pro-inflammatory, because leptin is a little bit pro-inflammatory, but like everything when we're talking about reactive oxygen species and stuff like that, is those all have their place and they have a certain function and signal to the body. So a little bit of inflammation is good, a lot of inflammation is bad. So the more you have circulating, the more inflammatory your body's going to be. And so then that kind of connects to those inflammatory markers going up with obesity and all those other things. So as we see like this, it's a part of the story that's creating overall inflammation in the body. It also is in our stress response. So if you have more levels of leptin circulating in your, it will downregulate cortisol production. So it's in that HPA axis, because your leptin actually docks in your hypothalamus. And if those receptor sites aren't working properly and you get more leptin and you're downregulating cortisol, and that kind of shows up for me, like in my labs, my labs were like baseline cortisol. Like I had a circadian response, but it was like a little bit in the morning and then it went down to point zero, point 0.2 or something like
Oh,
that.
jeez.
So it was like I was like at the very bottom. So it downregulates cortisol. And then it also influences for bone health, like bone formation and reabsorption. And also, like we were talking about before, it connects to thyroid health specifically. So those are like things that you wouldn't necessarily connect with like the hunger hormone, but it based on that's why some people call it the master hormone, because it affects so many different areas and so many other hormones, and especially being in that HPA axis and HPG axis and the brain gut axis. And another thing that like you had mentioned insulin resistance. If you're snacking in between meals, that's raising you're getting these little insulin spikes throughout the day, and those can actually fill up your leptin receptors as well. So they'll compete for the same receptors in the brain. So that'll also blunt that, make that receptor blind to what your leptin levels are.
Gotcha.
And it sounds like a lot of about leptin is about food, or because, and that's the surprising thing is, and this goes back to the Jack Cruz perspective on it, is it's actually more about light and getting proper light, because also another thing that will influence and increase our both blood sugar and insulin is blue light. So if you're getting a big hit of blue light throughout the day and even at night, that'll disrupt your circadian rhythm, which then creates those downstream effects. And leptin docks in the hypothalamus between, it's a range, but it's usually at night in the dark, and most most likely it's like in within midnight to 2 a.m.
Okay.
So if you're not sleeping in that window, or if you have blue light present, it's gonna knock that out, because it's gonna raise your insulin, it's gonna raise your blood sugar, and raise your cortisol, and that's gonna compete with and not allow the leptin to properly communicate. So it's both a sleep, a light story, and then also if you're snacking late at night, That's also spiking it. So it's this vicious circle that goes around.
I love it's always just so nice to get to talk to someone else who's as passionate about the light stuff, at least it
Mhm.
seems, as me, because I think everyone in functional medicine has their little subtopics that they love. There's people that love a certain type of test or they want to talk about mold all the time or whatever. And to me, this was just one of the most profound sub subjects that I ever stumbled upon. Even like you mentioning these different axes that come or involving the hypothalamus, right? So when I learned, because I had already had this FDN information, then I was connecting these other things. So FDN, one of the first things that you're learning about is the HPA axis, the HPT axis, all this kind of stuff. And then you find out that the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, is in the hypothalamus. And so now listen, you have to be a good scientist. Just because one thing means one thing is true does not mean the next thing's true. But I'll take a bet that if that thing lives in my hypothalamus, and this is not a proper way to say it, it doesn't live there per se, but if that's in there, then maybe, just maybe, the light influences have something to do with my entire hormonal makeup of my body. And it just, this is an anecdote, of course, but this made so much more sense to me when I saw my sister was sick when I was a kid. I was sick when I was a kid. My mom was super sick. My dad was the one with the worst health habits out of all of us. Now, of course, he would have a unique genetic makeup compared to my mom, sister, and myself, even though we're in the same family. I get that. But there was also one thing that he did differently than all of us. He's been a landscaper my whole life. And when I say landscaper, that man wakes up at sunrise, not because he's into health, just because that's what he chooses to do. He goes outside. He's outside for 10 to 12 hours a day. Even when he's driving, the windows are open. He comes in, he's been working his butt off all day. So he goes to bed early and on time and then does the same thing the next day. This has been for decades. And to the point where he is so tan. Have you ever been to like Key West or any of the Florida Keys and you've seen the lifers there that look like they're leather
Oh, yeah.
almost?
Mhm.
He's approaching that basically. I give him another
Mhm.
5, 10 years and he looks like walking leather. But that has to do something. Again, I know it's an anecdote, just one experience, but I'm like, how does he get away with smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day,
Mhm.
drinking Coca-Cola, eating pizza? I'm trying everything over here. And there was a time where I was still less healthy than him. And I have to think that we have focused on a lot of the right things in functional medicine.